June 21, 1923. A baby girl is born. The setting is the railway station building in Třešť, a small town in the Bohemian Moravian Highlands. Her father, Herta Kašparová, works here as a dispatcher. He is a Sudeten German, recently transferred from the Šumperk region. The family lives as an ethnic minority in a predominantly Czech community. But the girl carries a mark more visible than her heritage. Herta is born with a deformed right leg. The defect is severe. It twists her limb, forcing a heavy, rhythmic limp. In the quiet corridors of the station, the sound is unmistakable. The scrape of a foot, the uneven thud of a child trying to keep up. In a town of fewer than 3,000 residents, there is no such thing as a secret. Every neighbor watches. Every classmate notices the German girl who drags her leg across the cobblestones. The physical pain is constant, but the social isolation is absolute. Třešť was a closed circle of 3,000 people. In a town where everyone knew each other, Herta's defect was impossible to hide. The limp followed her everywhere. It echoed in the hallways of the local elementary school. Herta tried to blend in. She joined the Sokol. This was a Czech nationalist gymnastics organization. Its goal was physical perfection and national pride. Herta wore the uniform and spoke the language fluently. She even had Czech friends. But on the street, the mask slipped. At home, the family spoke German. Outside, they performed the role of Czech patriots. The mockery was relentless. Children are precise in their cruelty. Boys imitated her dragging walk. Girls whispered behind their hands. To them, she was a broken thing trying to act whole. They saw the German girl pretending to be one of them. The taunts were constant. Deep psychological scars formed. Herta was not just an outsider because of her blood. She was an outsider because of her body. 1938 changed everything. The Munich Agreement tore Czechoslovakia apart. Suddenly, being German was no longer a social burden. It was an opportunity. The family reputation for opportunism took its final shape. Alois Kaspar worked for the Czechoslovak railways. He had spent years integrating. Now he saw the wind shifting toward Berlin. He decided the family name needed a correction. He replaced the Czech spelling with a German one. Kaspar became Kasper. In the local registry, the father officially changed the family's identity. In March 1939, the father no longer had to pretend to be Czech. The mask of the Kaspar surname was discarded. 15 March 1939, German columns entered Prague. The independent state vanished in a single morning. In its place, the Nazis established the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. This was not just a shift in borders. For Herta, it was a social explosion. The hierarchy of the streets flipped overnight. Yesterday, the German minority lived in the shadows of the Czech majority. Today, they were the elite. They had the backing of the Wehrmacht. Speaking German was no longer a liability, it was a weapon. Reinhard Heydrich arrived to enforce the new order. He was the architect of the final solution. His objective was surgical, the total erasure of Czech culture. The process began with the elite. On 17 November 1939, the Nazis executed 9 student leaders and sent over 1,200 to concentration camps. The occupation authorities officially closed all Czech universities. A black notebook lay on the desk. This was the tool of Herta's new trade. In September 1942, the Nazi regime gave a 16-year-old girl a job others were terrified to even mention. She didn't hold the whip, she held the pen. The interrogation room smelled of old sweat and fresh ozone. Herta sat on a wooden chair, feet together, back straight. Across from her, a prisoner screamed in Czech. What does a person feel while translating pleas for mercy? For Herta, it was a career move. She listened to the jagged breathing of the broken and the thud of a Gestapo officer's fist. Then, she translated the agony into clean, bureaucratic German. The typewriter keys clicked, drowning out the moans. Herta recorded names, dates, and locations. She watched the machinery of terror from the front row. The process was cold, systematic. It stripped men of their dignity before stripping them of their lives. Efficiency brought promotion. The party transferred her to Zlín. Before the war, This city was the heart of the Bacha shoe empire. Now, the Nazis had seized the factories for war production. They turned the headquarters of a global brand into a regional center for the Gestapo. High-level resistance members arrived in Zlín in chains. Organized underground networks faced the girl with the notebook. She wasn't horrified, she was essential. Herta simply translated, 20 deaths. That is 2 full football squads, erased by one person. From the quiet offices in Zlín, her translations sent people straight to the gallows. Herta sat at the center of the Moravian security apparatus. She did not pull triggers, she turned Czech pleas into German reports. Resistance members and underground networks fell into the Gestapo's gears because of her ink. Arrests followed her words, interrogations followed the arrests. In the basement cells, the sound of a typewriter masked the screams. Torture extracted confessions. Most were false, born from unbearable pain, but the system did not care about the truth. How many died because of her work in Jihlava and Zlín? The exact number is buried in ash. Czech sources point to dozens of lives cut short. Estimates suggest she was responsible for at least 20 executions before her final crime even began. Was she a true believer? No. Herta differed from the typical collaborator. Most worked for the Reich out of paralyzing fear. Some genuinely worshiped the swastika. Herta Kašparová was different. Her fuel was not ideology, but a precise and calculated personal vendetta. While Herta settled her scores, the thousand-year Reich collapsed in 5 days. Adolf Hitler was already 5 days dead. His suicide in the Berlin bunker on April 30th shattered the Nazi spine. The war was over. Everyone knew it. Soviet armies swept through Czechoslovakia from the east. American divisions pressed from the west. On May 5th, the Prague uprising ignited. The resistance moved to reclaim the capital before the Red Army arrived. The fire spread. In Bohemia and Moravia, Czechs tore down the swastikas. In their place, blue, white, and red flags appeared on every balcony. For a moment, it looked like justice had arrived. The revolt reached Třešť on May 5th. The German grip loosened. Resistance members moved through the streets, reclaiming their town. In the house near the station, the scene was chaotic. Drawers were ripped out. Papers littered the floor. Czech civilians smashed the Kaspar family furniture into splinters. The crowd looted the rooms and dragged the occupiers' belongings into the mud. Crowds surged toward the Kaspar home at the station. The celebration at the station house ended in exactly 48 hours. While the local resistance hoisted flags and smashed the furniture in the Kaspar home, the Reich was preparing a final, bloody reflex. The animal was dying, but it could still bite. On May 7, 1945, the SS launched a counteroffensive from the city of Jihlava. This wasn't a tactical maneuver for territory. It was a rescue mission for German nationals and a punitive strike against the Czechs. In the final hours of the war, the SS executed one of the last successful German military operations of the entire conflict. Steel arrived first. Armored personnel carriers and heavy trucks rolled back into Třešť. The soldiers saw the Czech flags. They saw the liberated prisoners. The uprising had humiliated them, and the SS demanded blood as payment. They needed more than just firepower to clean the streets. The officers didn't know the faces of the rebels or who had led the mob at the railway station. They required a guide who knew every door and every local grudge. The SS needed a local informant. The SS officers did not recognize the faces of the rioters. They were outsiders in a town that hated them. But the railwayman's daughter knew every name and every secret. May 7, 1945. The sun rose over Třešť, but the war refused to end. SS units flooded the streets to reclaim what they had lost for a few hours. They dragged men from their homes. They herded them toward the town square and the stone courtyard of the town hall. Who was she looking for in this crowd? She wasn't hunting for hardened partisans. She was hunting for the witnesses of her own humiliation. The Mercedes-Benz shifted into first gear. The engine rumbled at a low, steady idle. Herta sat in the open-top car, flanked by black uniforms. 33 men stood against the wall. They were her neighbors, a barber she had seen for years, a railway worker who had greeted her father, a janitor who knew the school corridors. The car moved at a walking pace. The tires crunched on the gravel in the heavy silence. Herta did not speak. She simply leaned forward, her eyes scanning the faces she had known since childhood. Then the selection began. A pale finger extended from the car. She pointed, a sharp, wordless gesture. It was the gesture of a Roman emperor in a 20th century Czech village. One movement meant life, the next meant a bullet. She found the two men who had mocked her at school. She found the ones who had whispered behind her back. For Herta, this was not a military operation. It was a ledger being cleared. The SS officers nodded. They did not ask for evidence or names. Her finger was the only judge. Soldiers stepped forward and physically hauled the selected men from the line. Her finger did not tremble. She moved along the line of 300 men, selecting victims with the casual grace of a shopper. No words, no explanations. A pointed finger or a sharp snap of the digits was enough. Each gesture sealed a fate. The SS soldiers acted instantly. They hauled the selected men from the formation and dragged them toward the town hall courtyard. 33 neighbors, 33 men who had shared the same streets with her for decades. Why these 33? The list included 2 men who had mocked her limp 20 years ago in the schoolyard. This was not a military operation. It was a harvest of old grudges. The execution began within the hour. The air in the courtyard turned thick with the smell of burnt gunpowder and iron. The mechanics of the killing were precise. Men were forced to roll up their shirts. The white fabric exposed their chests. SS marksmen took aim directly at their hearts. Volley after volley. The sound of rifle fire shattered the silence of Terezin. The first bodies crumpled onto the stones. Blood seeped into the gaps between the gray cobblestones. 33 lives vanished in 60 minutes. The death toll represented 1% of the town's entire adult male population. Among the corpses lay the schoolyard bullies, the local shopkeepers, and the fathers of her childhood friends. The list of the dead remains. 33 names. The 33 names on the list were not insurgents. They were not resistance leaders. Herta Kašparová targeted men who had mocked a disabled girl 20 years earlier in elementary school. She watched the execution under the bright May sun. She did not look away as the bullet struck. To Herta, this was not a war crime. It was a closed chapter. She looked at the corpses not as a soldier of the Reich, but as a bullied schoolgirl finally holding the rifle. Her house had been ransacked. Her childhood had been a sequence of insults. Now, the offenders were dead. The town expected her to show horror. They expected a breakdown. Instead, she looked satisfied. The debt was paid. Justice, in her mind, was the smell of gunpowder and the sight of neighbors on the pavement. She believed the SS would protect her. She believed Germany would still win. She was wrong. Within hours, the sound of engines changed. T-34 tanks entered Třešť. Soviet units swept through the streets, and the German defense collapsed. In 1940, Herta Kašparová was 17. She didn't belong in a classroom anymore. The occupation had finished her education. To destroy a nation, the Nazis first erased its mind. They closed universities. They executed intellectuals. They banned the Czech language from the streets. But cultural genocide required more than just soldiers. It required eyes. The Gestapo needed those who lived among the enemy. They needed ethnic Germans who knew the local faces and hated their neighbors. Herta was the perfect tool. She spoke the language. She felt the resentment. She moved 30 kilometers from Třešť to Gilava. A small office in Gilava, the rapid-fire clack of a typewriter. Herta sat at a desk covered in lists of names. She wasn't just filing papers. The Gestapo lacked ears. Herta became both. During interrogations, she didn't just translate words, she decoded fear. The sound of her typewriter keys transformed whispered confessions into signed death warrants. She watched the suspects. She noted their stutters. She simplified the mechanism of terror. She was officially a clerk, but her role was far deadlier. Her presence at the table meant the difference between a release and a firing squad. Her real work happened during the screams of the interrogated. The protective dome shattered on May 8, 1945. Nazi Germany signed the unconditional surrender. The SS units that had reclaimed Třešť vanished into the smoke of defeat. For Herta Kašparová, the end of the war was the beginning of a hunt. She was no longer the hunter, she was the prey. Where do you run when your neighbors watched you point the finger? The answer was the border. Herta fled into the chaos of the Austrian frontier. She vanished into the gray tide of millions of displaced persons. In a sea of refugees, a 23-year-old girl is just another face. She likely expected the silence of a new life. But in small towns, memory does not have borders. The survivors spoke. Witnesses signed statements. The new Czech authorities tracked the geography of her betrayal. In 1946, the search ended. Czech police found her hiding in Austria. They shackled her and dragged her back to the town, where the pavement was still stained with the memory of her choices. She returned to face the families of 33 dead men. The Extraordinary People's Court convened in Třešť in September 1946. In the courtroom, prosecutors expected a standard defense. They waited for the phrase, "I was following orders." Instead, Herta bared the truth. Revenge. She spoke the word clearly. The courtroom fell into a vacuum of absolute silence. Judges in heavy robes leaned forward. They expected a manifesto of Nazi ideology. They found a resentful child in the body of a killer. The Extraordinary People's Court followed strict legal protocols. These were not show trials. Witnesses stood at the bar. They spoke of the May 7th massacre. They detailed her work for the Gestapo. Every denunciation was documented. Every interrogation she translated led to a grave. Herta stood by the barrier. She did not flinch. She admitted to sending 33 people to their deaths. Her motive was petty. She killed for childhood bullying. She killed because her family home was once ransacked. The scale of the state tribunal met the smallness of her soul. The prosecution presented the files. Crimes against humanity. Collaboration. The deliberate murder of Czech citizens. Evidence was overwhelming. The verdict was guilty. The execution required more than a simple gallows. Standard hanging was too quick, too merciful. The court demanded a public act of purification for the city of Třešť. For Herta Kašparová, they chose the pole hanging. This was the traditional Czechoslovakian method for traitors. It was a technical instrument of agony. Why not a standard noose? The pole method was designed to be slower and more humiliating. It ensured the condemned suffered exactly as their victims had. The device stood 3 meters tall. A stout vertical wooden pole, 60 centimeters wide and 5 centimeters thick. It was not a relic. Workers built it specifically for this day. At the very top, a metal hook waited for the rope. There would be no long drop, no snapped neck. September 13th, 1946. The afternoon sun hit the walls of Třešť Castle. A massive crowd gathered. This was no secret execution behind prison walls. Her former neighbors stood in the front rows. The families of the murdered men watched from the grass. They wanted to see the face of the girl who had traded their lives for revenge. There were no appeals, no chance for clemency. Executioners led Herta to the wood. They lashed her body to the pole with heavy cords. A thin noose tightened around her throat. The executioner stepped back. He removed the platform from under her feet. 10 to 20 minutes of conscious suffocation. That was the price. The pole hanging method avoided the sudden drop of a standard gallows. There was no snapped neck, no instant darkness, only the slow, rhythmic tightening of hemp against the throat. The mechanics were simple. A vertical wooden beam, a short rope, a stool or small platform. When the wood was pulled away, gravity didn't kill. It merely started a countdown. Herta Gruner stepped into the morning air of September 13th, 1946. She wore a simple dress. Her hands were bound. At 23 years old, her body still possessed the resilience of youth. But the sight of the Třešť Castle courtyard broke her. Did she remember the men she pointed out 15 months ago? The arrogant translator was gone. When she saw the pole, her legs turned to water. She collapsed. A scream tore through the silence of the courtyard. The guards didn't wait for her to recover. They grabbed her arms and dragged her through the dirt. Witnesses watched the former mistress of life become a trembling heap of biology. She begged, she wept. The power of the Gestapo had evaporated into the gray Czech sky. A Catholic priest stepped forward. He held a crucifix. He offered the final blessings of the church. Herta clung to his words, her chest heaving as she inhaled her last seconds of unrestricted air. The priest finished the prayer and stepped back. At 10 in the morning on September 13th, the arrogance of the Gestapo translator finally dissolved into raw animal terror. Herta Bota was 23 years old. Just months ago, she walked these streets as a mistress of life and death. One snap of her fingers, that was the price of a neighbor's life. Now her legs give out. She collapses. The guards grab her under the arms and heave her upright. She is no longer a soldier of the Reich. She is failing biology. A dark stain spreads across her clothing. Urine runs down her legs and pools in the dirt beneath the post. At this moment, nothing remained of the mistress of death except a terrified organism losing control. The device is a simple vertical pole. No trapdoor, no sudden drop. This was pole hanging. Czechoslovakia reserved this method for its most hated traitors. The executioner did not aim for a broken neck. He aimed for a slow, conscious struggle. She stared at the noose. The guards dragged her the final few feet. Her body went limp, a dead weight in their hands. They forced her to stand before the wood. On June 21, 1946, her authority ended in the mud. She was 23.